As much as that's the storyline, I think the more alarming or like under the radar story is the Big 12 not having many.
That's where I wanted to go next. No first round picks for the first time in history. And for the 10th straight year, it is the fewest amount of draft picks of any Power 5 school. The last decade, the Big 12 has provided Heisman Trophy winners, college football playoff representatives in the form of the Oklahoma Sooners, and thrills. I mean, I've really enjoyed watching the Big 12. It has not felt like a bad conference as a whole, just, right off the top, off the surface. But is this reflective of a real talent issue in the Big 12? And is that gonna change the perception in a way that's like they become the anti-SEC, where if you are, being able to pump up and be able to promote yourself and Danny, like you mentioned, maybe get some of those intangibles in the debate about whose conference is better than the others for the college football playoff purposes. Like, does the Big 12 have a problem right now?
I think so. I mean, if you look at there were 22 players selected from the Big 12 this year. At half of them, or 10 of them, were Oklahoma and Texas. And I think, let me check Oklahoma State here. Oklahoma State had
Chuba, Tylen.
4. So 14 of the 22 players drafted from the Big 12 came from 3 schools. That's a problem. That is, I mean, there's clear lack of parity when it comes to the talent and development at the programs over the long term. Now, that's not to say Baylor hasn't had some. It's not to say Iowa State's not going to have some. They have had some in recent years. It's just every single year when it's the same 2 to 3 programs producing all the talent. And again, Oklahoma had a run of number 1 picks. So, but it's like we mentioned with the SEC, all 14 teams produced. In the Big Ten, it wasn't all 14, but it was most of them. In the ACC, it wasn't all of them, but it was most of them. In the Pac-12, I don't know how many schools. I don't have it off the top of my head.
Utah and Washington State did not.
Yeah,
those are 2 that were on the pick list.
So it's like, it's a problem that I don't think you can ignore when 3 of your schools are producing so much of the talent and you don't have that much talent going in. Like if the Big 12's got 45 players selected and 20 of them are from 3 schools, that's fine. When you're only getting 22 players selected and nearly 2/3 of them are from 3 schools, that's not.
All right, I really went into this thinking that I was going to kind of hate on the Big 12, and I will in a second, but I want to defend them briefly.
What a lawyer.
Part of this is oh God, yeah. Part of this I think is cyclical. In that, think about it: West Virginia, newer coaching staff; Baylor, newer coaching staff; Kansas State, newish coaching staff; Kansas is Kansas; Texas Tech, newer coaching staff. So all these teams that you would be hopeful for to produce, somewhere between 1 and 2 draft picks, perhaps, they're all sort of very early in their changeover development cycle. So I can kind of give them a bit of a collective pass. I think, TCU had a decent draft. Iowa State did not have a good draft, but at the same time, they bring back almost everybody that they possibly can bring back. Like they're one of the tops in the nation in terms of returning experience. So that kind of makes sense as to why they didn't have a lot of guys drafted, because basically everybody's coming back. Now you can argue, yeah, bud, that's because they didn't have anybody with first round grades. And I'll buy that, but still, I bet you they have a decent number of 3rd, 4th, 5th rounders on that team when they do decide to declare. The issue here is largely, over the last couple of years, at least, Texas, right? There's only 2 teams in this league that recruit at a high level. Everybody else is hoping to have a top 25 type class. There's only 2 teams that really threaten top 10, top 5 status, and that's Oklahoma and Texas. Oklahoma was a pretty young team this last year. I think they'll have a lot of draft picks in next year's draft. Just look at some of these early mocks. I mean, there's a lot of Oklahoma guys on there. Texas has been by far the biggest underachiever relative to its recruiting rankings over the last 15 years or so. And if they get that figured out, the league looks a hell of a lot better. If they don't, then the league will continue to lag.
Do you have confidence that Sark and that staff are going to be able to create a little bit of a better conversion rate?
I would probably buy Texas if I could right now, and buy the Big 12 as a whole, not to catch the other leagues, but to close the gap between them and the Pac-12 somewhat. I think he'll be able to do a good job there. But then again, I thought Tom Herman would do a good job there, and that didn't work out. So
see, part of the concern for me though, if I'm the Big 12, is like, yeah, Oklahoma and Texas are the only two that really recruited a level where it's like, you know, you're spitting out draft picks whether you do anything with them or not. The players are just that good at that point. It's kind of like Michigan right now hasn't been winning a ton of games, but they're still churning out plenty of NFL draft picks because they're getting a ton of talented players. But like when you look at the rest of the Big Ten, there's a lot of schools in the Big Ten that don't really recruit to the same level as Texas or Oklahoma. They're kind of recruiting at a similar level to Big 12, but they're churning out draft picks because they are developing the players. Like Iowa doesn't recruit wonderfully. It's recruited better in recent years, but its draft pick to recruiting ranking is probably, you know, above average. I think Wisconsin recruiting ranking to draft picks produced is probably above average. The Big 12, and maybe this is what Iowa State's becoming, and maybe to your point, Bud, because there has been some coaching turnover there lately that nobody's really been able to get that established, but the Big 12 doesn't really have that program yet. And other Power 5 conferences have multiple versions of them.